For those who seek adventure, this is the Buffalo Roamer Podcast, sharing the people, places, and moments that make a life on the loose worth living.
The thing that's going to stick out to you most is when they open up that plane door. The cold is something like you've never felt.
The jungle's so thick, even if you had a machete, you couldn't get through it.
There's a huge blonde grizzly bear. And when it saw us, this thing put its head down, stomped on the ground, and hissed like an alligator.
I just crossed this brutal stretch of desert, and I was really suffering.
I'm your host, Will Collins. I'm an adventurer, outdoorsman, and roamer of wild places. I've backpacked the Brooks Range, rafted the Grand Canyon, and have canoed from source to sea, both the Mississippi and Yukon rivers. I live for adventure, travel, fresh air, and diving into the unknown. And now, I hope to share my passion with you on the Buffalo Roamer Podcast. Here we go, episode 92, slowly creeping in on 100 episodes. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you're subscribed if you are not already, if you're enjoying the show. That way you get the latest episodes downloaded automatically. Come join me on the river. I got spots, just a few spots available for October Green River, Moab, Utah trips, October 2024. Absolutely fantastic flat water canoe trip and some of the most pristine and awe-inspiring wilderness in the lower 48. Check that out at buffaloroamer.com. Just a few spots left for October trips, and keep an eye out for 2025 trip dates as well. Those will be coming soon, and would love to be able to get out on the water with you and experience some adventure. So check them out, buffaloroamer.com. Big thank you to Soda Peak Outfitters. Experience true Wyoming wilderness with sodapeakoutfitters.com. They offer guided and DIY pack trips, fishing trips, you name it, into the Yellowstone ecosystem just outside Jackson Hole there. sodapeakoutfitters.com. SREgear.com, family-owned and operated outdoor gear shop in Black River Falls, Wisconsin. And thank you to Fischel Paddles, makers of fine, handcrafted wooden canoe paddles, FischelPaddles.com. Discounts associated with all of those great companies for Buffalo Roamer listeners. Okay, today's episode is with Boyce Upholt. Boyce is a author, a writer, and a fan and adventurer of the Mississippi. Really enjoyed talking with him, and his new book is out now. It is called The Great River, The Making and Unmaking of the Mississippi. That's much of what we talk about here in this episode. I listened to this book as an audiobook. I really enjoyed it. Lots of great stuff and history about the river. We'll chat about it now, so go pick up your copy, The Great River, The Making and Unmaking of the Mississippi by Boyce Upholt. And without further ado, here's episode 92 of Buffalo Roamer Outdoors. Boyce, what's going on, man? How you doing?
Not much. I'm doing well, Will. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So are you down in New Orleans, I gather?
I am. I just got back to New Orleans today. I've been on the up and down the river. I was in St. Louis this morning for a book event, but back home in New Orleans.
Nice, man. That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really enjoyed your book. You sent me a early copy, and then I got a chance to dive into the audio version as well. And the book just dropped here recently. And man, really well written, and thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a fantastic read.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
How did you, I guess first I'm going to give you a layman's perspective on kind of what I thought the book was about and the takeaway of the book for people who haven't read it, obviously, or just listening. Man, it's a fantastic history, essentially, through like stories, but true historical stories of the Mississippi and of the river. And it's like if I were a kid and wanted a textbook to teach me about the Mississippi River, this is like the textbook I would want, because it's just like firsthand historical stories, which I thought was awesome.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think that's pretty close to what I was aiming to do. I mean, I fell in love with the river on a paddle trip almost 10 years ago now, and was living kind of in the shadow of the river and hadn't even realized how beautiful it was. And so I wanted to figure out, why is this river here? Why does it look the way it does? And why didn't I know about it? And that eventually led me down all these rabbit holes, and wanted to use all these historical stories to make it come alive for readers and make its older forms that have been lost come alive as well. So how long did it take you to come to this project and to work with this project? I mean, it depends on how you define it. So the first time I paddled on the Mississippi was in 2015. I was kind of a budding young journalist, and I was living in rural Mississippi, and a man named John Rusky, who might be familiar to some of your listeners, was famous around those parts. And I convinced a magazine to let me kind of write about this crazy guy that wanted to take tourists out on this big industrial river. And it, I think in some ways the book was born on that trip. I knew as soon as I was driving home from that at the very least I'd do some more magazine stories about the river. By 2017, I sort of had plans to write a book. I think I connected with my agent sometime around then. We didn't sell the book till 2020, and now it's mid 2024. So it's, 4-year project, a 7-year project, a 9-year project. It just depends on where you draw the starting line.
It's awesome, man. And I love how it started on a paddling trip, because it's not a paddling book. It's it's a book about the river, which of course paddling is an aspect of the river, but beautiful how it started out on a canoeing trip.
Yeah. And I think maybe secretly it is a paddling book. I've been having a lot of conversations with Dean Klinkenberg, who's been on your show. We just did an event in St. Louis together. And it made me think, it's like everyone would write a different river book, but I think because paddling is the way I found the river and still my preferred form of getting on the river, that does color a lot of how I, wind up seeing what's been done to it, interestingly.
Yeah, fantastic. I want to know is like how the detail of some of the stories. You must have been spending time in the library, just like cruising through, old historical firsthand accounts to pull some of these stuff. Like I'm just imagining you sitting in the stacks of a library. Is that like that a fair assessment? Or
yes, I was strangely lucky. I sold the book in late 2020. So like COVID had fully hit. I'd been planning this book for years, and I thought, as soon as I sell this book, I'm going to go hit the road and wander the watershed and see things firsthand, and was wary of doing that. But I think there was a good and up and downside for it. I mean, I think the book is better for it for 6 months, I was just, giving myself what feels like a graduate level education in archaeology and colonial history and all these different things. I am a completist. Like I felt determined I was specifically at the Tulane Library here in New Orleans, and kind of like any book that I thought might possibly be relevant, I was determined to pull off the shelf and like at least skim it quickly, which again, I think it adds to the book. It was a lot of work. It was a bit exhausting.
I can imagine, man. I can imagine. It's a lot of history on America's most magnificent river, right? I went back 4,000 years, and it's 40% of the U.S. And I've been saying this a lot, and I think it's true. I wondered when I sold the book, like, why isn't there a book like this, a sort of social, ecological history of the river that's presented, hopefully accessible to people that aren't scholars? And then I was like, I think because only someone who hadn't published a book would try and do something like this. So, that was another question. Is this is your first book?
This is my first book. Yeah.
And how long have you been writing? You said you were a journalist, because it's really well constructed, I think.
Thank you. I guess, I always wanted to be a writer. Growing up, I thought I'd write novels and short stories. Didn't know how to do that. And that's part of what led me to the Mississippi. I grew up in suburban Connecticut, didn't think anything about the Mississippi at all. And was kind of like, maybe one way to become a writer is to go somewhere that I thought was exotic. And I thought that when I was offered a job in rural Mississippi, I was like, well, that seems pretty exotic. So I wound up there. And so I think the first magazine story I ever wrote was in 2013. So it's been a little bit more than a decade. I just started out writing, little pieces for Delta Magazine, Mississippi Magazine, 2 great publications, but very local. And then kind of just looked up the ladder and tried to climb. But yeah, like I think early on when I fell in love with the river, that was only 2 years into kind of writing professionally. And I thought the book might be like a good way to climb. I was like, if I could sell a book about this river, then I'll become a bigger name. Then it just took longer. I think I've done well, fortunately, since coming up with that plan, but still having the book out in the world. It really has been transformative. So
that's great. I believe it. And it only just came out, right? Yeah,
it's been out a week and a day now.
Awesome. And how has it been that it's been officially out?
It's been really cool. It's just like things. Yeah, like I've done pretty well as a writer. I've published in some big magazines, but most people, it's rare that someone would recognize my byline, let alone my face. And so like it's been reviewed in the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, and mentioned in passing in Outside magazine. So it's just been cool to, and had 2 events now in person, and they both had, 60 to 80 people coming out, and one in Hartford, Connecticut, my hometown, it was at the Mark Twain House, so that helped. But still, it was like people that don't live in the watershed were deeply curious about the river. So it was cool to see that it's a fascination for everyone.
Yeah, man, that's amazing and awesome. And I liked how the book was broken up in 3 parts. And when I was going through, I mentioned I listened to the audiobook, which I thought was cool. And I probably forgot more already. I just read it and it was fascinating, but I've forgotten more already than, I've learned so much, but I've already forgotten so much that I want to retain just from going through it, because it's just so jam-packed with cool stories and information. But it's basically broken up into 3 parts. Pre-1800s, like, native cultures and pre-native cultures and the making of the Mississippi that way. And then the American River, and then, the river of today and tomorrow. And I'd be interested to touch and try and touch on all these parts. But for me, right when you got into the mound culture stuff, I was hooked right away. Give me a little rundown or like an overarching history, not history, but like a general rundown of the mound making cultures and the Mississippian culture for folks who have no idea that these fabulous societies existed right on the banks of the mighty Miss.
Yeah. And I was one of those people that had no idea. Honestly, even when I started planning the book, when I sold the book, I didn't know much about these mound building cultures, earthworks, as I call them now. The most famous one's Cahokia, which maybe people listeners might be familiar with. So there's more than 100 of these earthen pyramids, they're often called, but they're flat topped. And this was this epic city, essentially, that was across the river from what is now St. Louis. It was built about 1,000 years ago, a little more than that. And it's just staggering to go there and to see these, and you can't even fully appreciate what they once were, but reading about what they once were, they're very carefully arranged along solar astronomical phenomena. And it was, I forget the number of people, but at the time it was built, it was larger than London was at that time. And I think people don't think of, prehistorical North America or indigenous people in North America as living in cities, but this very much was a city. But in some ways, Cahokia to me is like a culmination of an even longer history, right? So Cahokia, if anyone knows anything, they tend to know Cahokia, but then you go back, there's Poverty Point down here in Louisiana is the one that I find the most fascinating, but it goes back even earlier than that. So we're talking, I think 5,000 years ago, people started building these complexes of earthworks, earthen mounds that were carefully arranged that, to me, it seems clear that they must have had some kind of spiritual meaning, right? It's hard to know what people were thinking thousands of years ago, but they, I get into the book into sort of some indigenous cosmology and how contemporary indigenous people, some of the stories they tell and what they might tell us about what these earthworks mean. The short version is basically, when I look at them, they show me that the Mississippi River, and in particular the lower Mississippi River down here in Louisiana, seemed to have been a spiritually important place to people all over. People recognized it was just so rich, so filled with life, that it was kind of like an origin point for a lot of things, a lot of cultures. And that, I don't know, someone who lives on the lower Mississippi River and loves the river, it was really affirming to see that history.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I think maybe it resonates with me in the same way that it does with you, because I'm up here in Illinois, and we have a lot of as you mentioned, near St. Louis. Then we have ones closer to me that I've just recently found out about, one in the shape of a thunderbird, and all these unique stuff. And it's just so fascinating to think of what life was like along the river then, when civilizations were still bustling and life was bustling, but just in a completely different way, and how we know so little about it right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing again, as the perspective of a paddler, I think part of why I missed it at first is you can't see these from the river anymore. And I think they were never built so close to the main channel of the Mississippi that you might have seen them. But it's a reminder of how much bigger the river used to be, that people would go up all these tributaries, and there's this lusher world. And we have just a smaller world now because of all the levees on the river.
Yeah. And it's interesting too. I think you're right in that is part of the reason why they're not as celebrated or as even known, I should say, is because, when you're there and you don't, you can't really tell what's going on unless you have a view from above, right?
Yeah. I mean, I wish there was like a shuttle service so that every through paddler, when they got to St. Louis, could like go out and see Cahokia, because I feel like it would like complete the river experience in a certain way. But yeah, you're just not going to get to experience these if you're focused on the river, like being on the river alone. So.
And I need to go to Cahokia. I haven't. But you mentioned you tell one little anecdote in the book about your experience at Cahokia. But I'm wondering what it was like for you. Like what when you went there, was it? I mean, I know the antidote from the book, but was it like powerful? Was it sad? Was it like nothing? What was your takeaway?
In some ways, all of those. I don't know. Yeah. So I went. It's funny. So Big Muddy Mike of Big Muddy Adventures had told me, like, you got to go at sunrise and see. It's going to be so powerful to see it at sunrise. And so I made it a point to, like, get up super early. I don't even remember what I was in town for. I was going to drive out to, it's like a little ways out of the city. I'm going to get up there early. And I walked up there, and then these 3 ladies came up behind me, and they had been up all night drinking at bars. And we're just like, this will be a cool place to go see the sunrise after a late night at bars. And it's, this is East St. Louis. It's beyond East St. Louis, but it's a pretty rough area these days. I kind of list out in the book some of the various things. There's like a theater that was showing porn films before it closed down, and some decrepit motels all around. It's like not the most beautiful part of America anymore. So it was depressing. And I also did not love Mike, but I was like, I'm not feeling this spiritual thing with the sunrise. Maybe it's the presence of these ladies that are just talking about their wild night, but it's not getting me. But also, I mean, that gets into some of the, my own thoughts about earthworks and what they mean. I've come to think that they weren't necessarily built as like the worldview wasn't like I'm the king on top of something looking down. It's not like a mountaineering thing. It was more about the building of them that mattered the most. And so climbing to the top isn't the most important spiritual experience. It's not in the book, but I think what was more powerful to me was on a separate trip. I went out with some archaeologists, and they drove me around the area, and they were showing me sort of places that are still farmed, that have been farmed for thousands of years. And you can kind of still see the shape of, I don't know, it just being in a space where like, agricultural society's been here for so long. That felt more powerful to me in a way than being on top of the mount.
Yeah. And maybe in part, and I kind of feel the same way, like I mentioned about the mound, which is kind of sad. The mound near Illinois, like the Thunderbird, like it's this big, huge, powerful thing, but it's hard to get the perspective. And then when you tie it in with like the, I don't want to say degrading, but the like, just, 21st century state of life that's there. It's like an odd juxtaposition, if that's a word.
It is. Yeah. It took me, like I said, I didn't know much about the mounds. I moved to the Mississippi Delta and lived near a very small Indian mound. And someone told me what it was. I was like, okay, who cares? It's like a foot of soil. And and honestly, the one that moved me most, I've looked at maps and never quite figured it out. It's almost this like mystical experience. One time I was driving across the Delta, taking a back road I'd never taken before. And then I was in this, most of the Delta is very agricultural, but there are certain parts that are wilder feeling, a little bit swampier. And I was in one of those parts, and this back highway just went by this pretty large mound that was kind of grown up into trees. And this was further along. Like I had started to think a lot about the mounds and what they meant. And somehow this like thing that I didn't expect to see rising out in the middle of this more wild feeling place was the first time I was like, okay, I like get it. I feel it. And it feels all the more mystical. I'm like, I don't even know what mound it was. I don't remember what highway I was on, so I could never recreate it and go back there.
What, do you have a favorite story or a favorite moment in history from the river in your reporting that you enjoyed?
It's hard. There's so many interesting things. I think one thing that, I love sort of like frontier stories. I think that love is complicated, but again, having met the river in Mississippi in this very agriculturally tamed place, I was fascinated. Like the idea of the Mississippi Delta, is a cotton kingdom. It's the land where the blues began, and that's all pretty modern. It's not more than like 100 years old. Is sort of the images that we associate with that place. And so when I learned that, go back another 50 years, and it was kind of like Wild West style logging territory, and these like timber camps in the swamps, and there were panthers and bears and all of that. I find that stuff just cool. Right? Like there's a curious part of me like, oh, if I could get sent back to some Mississippi River of the past. That might not be the most pleasant because it was a little too rugged, but I think it would be fascinating to see the kind of rough and tumble river culture of those frontier years.
And the timber camps were notorious spots, huh?
Yeah. I mean, that's just American culture in a lot of ways, but they were a lot of drinking, a lot of carousing, boxing, those sorts of things. So,
another part of the history of the river that I always think of as fascinating is, the shanty boats and the new term I learned from your book, the Kentucky boats. Is that right?
Well, Kentucky flatboats, those were sort of that was before shanty boats even. That was like when the first farmers were showing up in Ohio and Kentucky, and they didn't want to haul their goods over the Appalachian Mountains. Those are like the rafts that they would build and bring their stuff down to New Orleans.
And so they would start. So that was essentially the first barges then, huh?
Yeah. Actually, the barges you see on the river today were ultimately modeled after these flatboats. They used to have sort of little cabins on top, and then by the time that steamboats came along, and then the kind of towboats we have today, they were like, well, we don't need people on these anymore. So they knocked the cabins off, but kept the rest of the basically like flat bottom design because it was good for not pulling a lot of draft.
Explore the beautiful and rugged Wyoming backcountry with Soda Peak Outfitters in Moran, Wyoming, just down the road from world-famous Jackson Hole. SodaPeakOutfitters.com is the team to talk to get off the beaten path and into an unforgettable wilderness experience. Nestled in the heart of the greater Yellowstone area, Soda Peak calls Bridger Teton National Forest and the Teton Wilderness home. They specialize in guided and DIY fishing and pack trips into some of the most pristine and remote wilderness and water that the lower 48 has to offer. Pack trips by horse, mule, or llama make getting deep into the rugged backcountry doable and makes it a Western adventure in itself. I know one of the trips that I'd love to do is their thoroughfare fishing trip, where with a horse pack team, they take you into the headwaters of the famed Yellowstone River to fish and explore over 5 days. Untouched water, rising trout on a summer morning. Yeah, that sounds right up my alley. They also offer a single-day guided fishing trips as well as trail rides and more. Their pack trips are a great way to disconnect with civilization and reconnect with nature and the mountains. Charles is one of the owners there and the guy to talk to. He can help you tailor a custom trip or get you signed up for any of their classic adventures. Check them out at SodaPeakOutfitters.com. That's soda like the drink, peakoutfitters.com. Or give Charles an email at charles@SodaPeakOutfitters.com and use code BR2024 at checkout for 5% off any trip you take with Soda Peak. That's BR as in Buffalo Roamer 2024. Experience true Wyoming wilderness with Soda Peak Outfitters. Yeah, it'd be and the shanty boat stuff was a product of the Great Depression. Is that right?
There's various ways you can trace it back. I think the first boom was actually kind of a decade or so after the Civil War, where there were some people, like there were some economic struggles back then, and there were just some people that were so broken by that war that had trouble settling back down into society. And so, the river at that point was a place where if you built a boat and set it out, it was kind of quasi public space, and you could make a life out there. I think it came back. I mean, there was kind of like it ebbed and flowed through the years, but the Great Depression, there was a big boom again because again, people didn't have anywhere else to go, and so they said, if I can find some scrap wood, I can build a little house and float it down the river.
Yeah. The book broken up in the different sections, to up to 1803 and then 1803, more or less up into modern day. I'm trying to remember, what was the distinction there of 1803?
1803 is the Louisiana Purchase, right? So that was that's what made the river fully American. We had sort of claimed most of the East Bank, but not New Orleans. And to me, that was sort of like that middle section is really about this 2-century long process of trying to seize control over a river that's pretty hard to control. And there you could start that at 1720, which is when the French built the first levee in New Orleans. There's like lots of dates you could put that to, but to me, sort of the sense of like, we really couldn't have done what's been done to the Mississippi until one nation or empire, as I call it a lot in the book, had control of the whole river. So to me, 1803 is like a good marking point of, when the first changes were about to come.
And then it's basically just, working with the river to try and, get whatever meet whatever ends is most important economically, usually at the moment, right? So it's all of the picking out all of the sticks with the boats. What were those ones called?
Snags, yeah. So it's crazy to me to think about what the river, how filled with wood the river used to be. The snags were basically not just sticks, but like whole giant trees, these huge trees, and they'd be sunk in the bottom, but part of them would be stuck in the bottom of the mud, part of them would be sticking up on the surface, and so they would be pretty destructive to a boat that ran aground on them.
And so there was a guy who engineered or who created a whole specific boat that was a snag boat or snag remover that would basically had like a crane on the front, more or less, that would reach in and clear all these massive log jams.
Yeah, it's a little more steampunk than that. I mean, the biggest technology was like a metal crossbar that he would like just ram the boat as hard as he could against the part of the wood that was sticking up to kind of like jolt it free of the mud, and then they could pull it up and start dragging it out of the water, because there had been earlier attempts with just the crane and that wasn't enough. They needed steam power to like bash their way through these trees. So yeah, that was Henry Shreve, who's like the first guy to really make a dent in the river in a lot of ways. There's one historian that I cite who kind of was like, in the South in particular, there's no individual that reshaped sort of the landscape more than this guy, Henry Shreve. So he pulled out all these snags, and then he didn't want more snags to form. So started cutting down the trees on all the banks and shaving down this forest. And it was just, again, as this is the case a lot in this book, if you do one thing and then other things you don't expect to happen follow that. And so ripping out these trees kind of set loose a lot of mud and it caused the river to shift. So every solution seems to have a new problem that it causes.
So jumping around a little bit here, but can you give me like a layman's rundown of the current Mississippi River and how the flood system and how the flow should work? So like if you were to say, okay, here's a wild river, call it, there's not many left anymore, but call it, the Yellowstone River or whatever. And this is how a normal river would flow. Just starts high point, goes to a low point, meanders. Mississippi River obviously has been engineered. We have locks and dams. We have levees. So is there a way to just give like a layman's breakdown of the flow of the Mississippi?
Maybe. I mean, one thing I'll say first is that I have my bias as a guy who's always lived on the lower river is like I think of the Mississippi as including so many rivers, right? So the Missouri and the Ohio and the Mississippi. So I don't want to get too long in it, but I could tell you kind of what has been done on the main branch of the Mississippi. You kind of start. You got a good ways. I mean, the headwaters are engineered, but engineered for looks, right? I think a lot of paddlers may know this, but those rocks that you see at Lake Itasca were laid out because it had just been kind of like a muddy outflow from this pond. And then it was like, that's not grand enough for a river like this. So in the 1930s, we put in some rocks there. And then a little bit downstream from that, there's kind of some small reservoirs meant to ensure that like we could get the right of water down into Minneapolis for boats. And then in Minneapolis, you start getting into the real dams that are meant I guess it's mostly past Minneapolis. There are some dams in Minneapolis. They're complicated. But downstream from there, you get to the navigation system where dams are built to create these pools so that the river can be held deep enough year round, not year round since they close in the winter, but deep enough for consistent passage of larger ships. And you pass through those dams with locks. And then those go all the way down to St. Louis.
And there's 30 something of them.
I don't. It sounds about right. I don't. There's so many numbers in the book that I've lost many of them. Same way, I can't recall everything. But yeah, and you get levees starting in that same stretch. So they're kind of inconsistent. There are no levees throughout the whole Upper Mississippi National Wildlife Refuge. So there's that's a different space. But when you get below the refuge, about half of the river's natural floodplain has been cut off by levees. And then the locks and dams stop in St. Louis right before the Missouri comes in, essentially. And then as you get down, then it's just a leveed river. And you get down to the lower Mississippi, which naturally would have this just massive, massive floodplain, almost 100 miles across in places. And that floodplain has been reduced in scale by like 90% by this system of levees. And the levees down here, the levees above the lower river are local projects for the most part, which has its own set of complications. But down in the South, this giant, massive river, it kind of eventually was determined only the federal government has like the money and capability to build a levee system to hold back a river this big. And so the 1,000 miles from Cairo, Illinois down is protected by this like absurdly large system of federal levees.
And a couple things here. One is that as a northerner and a man of the upper Mississippi, you always heard and hear of levees, and it never really clicked with me like what exactly it was and how exactly it works. You hear of the levee breaking, or during Katrina, or all of these, how important it is in all of these storms and all of the hurricanes, but I never really clicked with it. But literally, it's just a massive earth. It's our own earthwork, I suppose. It's just a massive hedge, I guess, or berm that runs all the way down the river. And it's supposed to be high enough to keep the mighty Mississippi within its banks. And so if it gets high enough to go over those levees, then everything behind the levee, which is at a lower elevation, gets flooded. And so in addition to those levees that run down, as emergency back off points, they have overflow areas or overspills or I don't know what
spillways they call it, like floodways, spillways, depending. Yeah, there's big gates that we can open up. They're all down here in Louisiana, and it's when there's very specific sort of trigger points of this number of cubic feet per second, then that means the Army Corps can open gates here or there and then send some water into basically wetland areas that give a different path to the Gulf of Mexico. So,
and all of this, is just a big conundrum, basically, right? Because there's so many different interests, there's so many different stakeholders, there's so many different views on what is right and what is wrong. It's just like a big, to use a Southern term, a big, bowl of jambalaya. It's like gumbo. It's like everybody's has a different opinion and on how it should be and how it should be managed. And so I'm wondering if you could lay out a few, and we can maybe go back and forth, but like a few of the different main stakeholders and positions, because from my perspective, at least, on one end you have the folks, or you have people who want the river to run free, and then you have basically people who are in support of the levee system and the way that the river is managed now. Explain to me what the problem is, if there is a problem from someone's perspective with the levee system.
Yeah. And I mean, the conundrum is right. I mean, I feel like when you were introducing the book before, you're like, it's this history, but there is this last section, and it was precisely that. It was conundrums, and that was my thing. I was like, I think I found 7 spots across the watershed where there is a conundrum here where different people can't agree about things, and I want to go talk to them about it. So levees are only one of those. I think in some ways for the upper river and for the paddling community specifically, I think navigation structures and the locks and dams are a bigger issue. The levees there aren't really that many people that are arguing that we should get rid of the levee system here in the South. I'm in my house right now in New Orleans. I'm 3 blocks from the river. I'm like, no, you can leave that levee there. That's fine. We do not want to get rid of that. I lived in the Mississippi Delta for 9 years. And so it's this complex place, got a lot of problems, got a lot of beauty, and it's home to many people in the Mississippi Delta, and its modern form couldn't exist if we didn't have the levees there. But I do. It's like I wish I had been able to put it in the map or in the book. It doesn't reproduce well. If you look at maps taken from space, the lower Mississippi River is absolutely from the International Space Station. You can make it out no problem because most of the South is forested, and then you get to this old floodplain of the Mississippi River, and we've cut down basically all the trees, not all of them, but so many of the trees that this is brown space that you can see on the maps. And that used to be the giant cypress forest that surrounded the Mississippi River. Now it's all soybeans, a little bit of corn. And so that's the argument to take down the levees is in part like those forests are great. Like they're good for storing carbon for climate change. They are home to a lot of species. But also like the full functioning of a living river depends on being connected to its floodplain, right? Fish, it's like, it's a part of the river in my mind. The floodplain is still part of the river, even though it only is connected part of the year. But that partial connection is actually really valuable. It gives it the space that sort of like fish can go. It's calmer waters. It's waters filled with food for them. And so it's kind of like a nursery for a lot of fish. Those wetlands can help process all the fertilizers that are running off farms in the Midwest, right? It's like wetlands do that process. They clean up water. They're kidneys, as one biologist I know call them. So those would be the reasons to pull down the levees. Again, it's unlikely to happen in a large scale, but where possible on the lower river, it's like, can we get rid of farmland and put it back into wetlands? Can we pull back the levees in some places? And there are some places on like the Missouri and on the quote smaller tributaries, not that the Missouri is a small river, where some of these projects are happening of like pulling the levees back. So,
and how about then we'll go to the upper river. How about the pumping, the Yazoo River pumps that have been since we're into conundrums here, that have been batted back and forth for decades. Can you give me like a brief rundown on that?
Yeah. So the Yazoo pumps so I'll start with this. In 1941, there was a big flood in 1927. It was like the Hurricane Katrina of that era. And it took a while to sort of figure out the formal plan of how we were going to make a flood like that not happen. But by 1941, the government was like, okay, we've got our plan. And included in that plan was this project known as the Yazoo pumps that now in 2024 is still not built. So this is like this last remaining piece of this 80-year-old plan. And the idea was because of all the other flood protection, the bottom of the Mississippi Delta, so that region, that old floodplain in Mississippi below Memphis, is completely surrounded in levees and it's kind of like a bathtub now, right? So that keeps the Mississippi from flooding it, but that means when rain falls there, it gets trapped in that bathtub. And so there was this plan to build a pump and get the water out of there so that could be a productive space. And that's become a huge debate because, by drying out that land, what's going to happen economically, it's just going to help some farmers, and farmers tend to be rather wealthy and own a lot of land. And so it's this expensive government project that will mostly benefit a small number of white guys in a place that is majority black. And there are a lot of environmental groups that are saying, it's good to have water on this ground, that like we don't have so few wetlands left. Let's keep this as a wetland. And so that project has just been like the EPA has shut it down, and then Trump tried to bring it back, and then Biden shut it down again. And it's really remarkable to see it was three separate presidents, because Obama came into that too, all debating over this relatively small project. It's deeply, deeply important to the people that live there, but on a grander scale, it's not this huge thing. But I think to me, because it's this like last remnant of this 80-year-old plan that in some ways is out of date, that like we now think about flood control differently. That's part of why so many people get so caught up in the fight over the Yazoo pumps.
And how about the upper river, the locks and dams? What are the conundrums? The positives are shipping channels, right? And depth for big commerce. I think that's the main plus, right?
That is the big thing. Yeah. I mean, the navigation industry, like the river has been heavily reworked to its, not to its ecological advantage, heavily worked for the sake of the navigation industry. And the big argument is like, well, the Midwest depends on the navigation industry. And I think one thing is like, we don't really, like, that's a really hard thing to study and know. And maybe it's true. Maybe if we got rid of towboats and barges, that would be crippling for all these farming communities. But it's not actually, like, we don't have demonstrable evidence of that. And again, I think about like, it's a lot of less so on the upper river. This is more on the Ohio, but the navigation industry at large is a lot of petrochemicals and fossil fuels. And then it's a lot of soybeans and corn and stuff that's getting shipped abroad. It's like not products that they're not the best products for our country. They're just making, again, these farmers that own a lot of land wealthier. And it's kind of, a lot of people see the navigation industry as a handout to these big landowners. The flip side of that, this is a real conundrum in Minneapolis right now, where there's like a push afoot to take out some locks and dams that at this point don't even really serve navigation, because for various reasons that probably not worth all going into, but like boats don't go into Minneapolis anymore. There's no point. There's nowhere to go. And yet we still have two different dams and locks in this narrow little canyon, kind of the only canyon on the Mississippi River. And so a lot of people are saying, if we just took those out, we'd have whitewater rapids in downtown Minneapolis, and you could go on this like 8-mile crazy kayak ride and then get off the river and go drink a surly beer in a bar. And it would be this like strange urban paddling mecca. But the navigation industry has like really lobbied to say like, we don't really care that these aren't being used. We don't want them taken out. And that always befuddles me a little bit. And like I say this in the book, I'm sort of like, I kind of think they're really scared if that happened and people are like, oh crap, like a free flowing Mississippi River is this beautiful, fun thing. Then people might look at all the other locks and dams downstream that are more useful and just be like, well, what could this river be like? Do we really want these anymore? So yeah, it's still a hot topic in Minneapolis.
Yeah. I think all of these are hot topics all up and down the river, and
yeah,
it's easy to see both sides. I mean, ecology, and a wild free river when applicable, especially when a dam isn't doing anything, that seems to make a lot of sense.
But I will say there's like better arguments than just that. A lot of people are worried about those dams hold back all this mud and God knows what's in that mud. And so if you take those dams out, all of a sudden you just get this like dose of toxic sediment coming downstream. But so yeah, it's never simple. There's and I tried to talk to everyone on every side while in the end also sharing sort of my point of view at least a little bit in the book. So.
Hey, it's Will here. Want to take a moment to let you know about today's sponsor, SREgear.com. SRE Gear is a family-owned and operated outdoor gear shop in Black River Falls, Wisconsin, and they have everything you need for your next adventure. Whether you're camping, backpacking, hiking, paddling, or just getting out there and exploring, SREgear.com has the gear you need to get you to those places you love. I recently picked up a new Garmin InReach from SRE. I needed a new communication device for the guided canoe trips I've been leading, and after talking through a few options with the owner, Nick, there, he helped me sort out what I needed and get squared away. And that's one of the things that sets SREgear.com apart is the unbeatable customer service. Call or email with any questions, and you'll talk with the owner, Nick, or someone there close to him. So before you go and buy any outdoor equipment from a big box store, be sure to check out family-owned and operated SREgear.com, and be sure to use the discount code WILL at checkout for 10% off your first purchase. That's discount code WILL at checkout for 10% off. SREgear.com. Great gear, great prices, unbeatable customer service. Hey, it's Will here. I want to take a moment to let you know about our show sponsor and partner, Fischel Paddles, makers of fine, handcrafted wooden canoe paddles. I spent a lot of time paddling rivers and lakes, and Fischel Paddles are the best canoe paddles that I've come across. I use the Ray Special model myself, and I outfit all the guided trips that I run with Fischel Paddles too, because I think they're the best. Each paddle is handmade by Greg Fischel at his shop in Flagstaff, Arizona, from a single piece of wood. What I love most is the shape and feel of the paddle. Other than being beautiful and efficient, it puts less strain on your shoulders and arms than a typical paddle would, while actually giving you more control and finesse with each stroke. Plus, the shape of the blade just feels right cutting through the water. All paddles are customizable from the type of wood, whether that's cherry, ash, or maple, to laser engravings, and my favorite, which is the leather strap that Greg pins around the shaft so that it doesn't get beat up as you run along the gunnels, prying off or doing the J-stroke in the back of the stern there. So go get yourself a Fischel paddle now and feel the difference. Use the code WILL at checkout. That's WILL to get a free wooden paddle hanger with any paddle purchase. That way you can show off and organize that new handmade paddle. Check them out at FischelPaddles.com. That's FISHELL paddles.com. Fischel Paddles, handcrafted wooden canoe paddles. You had to meet some interesting people, man, and lots of great stories about meeting interesting people in that book. But yeah, you traveled all up and down the river talking to folks, huh?
I did, yeah. And like I said, I never got up the Ohio, which is still, I've been in that territory in a different era of my life, but went up the Missouri as well, and yeah, tried to meet as many people as I could.
Do you have a favorite section of the Mississippi?
I mean, I can't tell to what extent it's sort of like my hometown thing versus favorite part stretch, but I do think, and I know you've seen this. I've been halfway jokingly on social media been saying, I think we need to turn the lower Mississippi River into a national park. but I really do think I'm going canoeing there next week. I'm really excited between Clarksdale and Rosedale. It's just, it's so wild feeling, right? The levees are miles back from the river. So you have these giant forests on each side. You've got these giant sandbars. John Rusky, good friend, canoe guide, this is 10 years old. And I think we've lost some of it, but he has a concept of wild miles of like, if sit in that spot in the river and do you see anything that is clearly human? And I think between Memphis and Baton Rouge, it's like 70% wild miles, and that stretch down there in the Delta is even more. So I think it's just so gorgeous. And interestingly, like as that the time I spent in the library looking at the history, all throughout history, everyone just dogs on the lower river, and they're like, it's flat and it's boring and blah, blah, blah. And like, that's complicated. I think some of that is because, it's part because the driftless and the upper river is so beautiful. And this is a very different kind of river in the South. I think it's part because like the steamboat era was an era when a lot of travel writers were European and they were coming over and they didn't like slavery in the South. And so they sort of had reason to disparage the landscape. But I think that we can move past that now and recognize that it's a truly gorgeous stretch of river down there.
Oh man, it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. And as you said, it's just like wild as can be. And what's the term of the forest that runs along the inside of the levee there?
The Batcher. Yes. The Batcher is like the land between the levees, between the levee and the river.
And just abundant and wild and, teeming with wildlife. And man,
and that's what got me. Yeah. I was like living in the Mississippi Delta, and I lived there for 6 years without getting on the river. And it was very green because it's very agricultural, but it's very orderly. It's all these straight lines. And then I got into the Batcher, and it wasn't really just the river. In some ways, I think when I'm on a canoe in the middle of the Mississippi River, it's almost too much water and you can't appreciate it. But it's like when you get off and get on those sandbars, or you like get to walk in that forest, you're like, oh my gosh, there's like this giant seething wilderness in the middle of the continent here. So
yeah, and it's just I'm preaching to the choir here, I know, but just so underrated. It's like you said, people just can't comprehend that you can have this amazing wilderness experience on the Mississippi River. People are so used to it just being like, the ditch or, I don't know. I just don't think they understand.
I agree. Well, and this is I'm not going to complain about the Wall Street Journal reviewing my book. And it was the reviewer clearly understood the book, but then the photo they chose to run on the front page of the book section was of the Chain of Rocks Canal in St. Louis. And I'm like, that is not even the Mississippi River. Like, that's the most man-made part. And it's the part that like confirms this stereotype. I don't think the art director who picked that photo read the book, because I'm like, this is exactly what I'm saying. The river is not in this book. So
yeah. I think of like the lower Mississippi, man. I just think of massive sandbars and just like massive driftwood bonfires. Just burn as much driftwood as your heart desires. It's the best.
Exactly. Yeah. I always think there's one campsite I had. I think it was Easter Day. The river was pretty low, and it was like it felt like we were on a bluff. It was like a sandbar, and then it just sheer dropped like 20 feet to the river, and was like sitting between some willow trees on this sand cliff, watching a thunderstorm blow in off the, I don't know if it was the White or the Arkansas, but like coming down a tributary essentially. And it's incredible. So
yeah, one of my favorite spots from the Mississippi from my through paddle was the confluence of the Arkansas and the Mississippi. And then to find out that also was a historic spot from your book. I think that's one of the spots where they started moonshining. And then also, wasn't it that was like one of the coordinates where they had started I guess mapping the lower area from.
Oh yeah, it's not far from there. Pretty close to that. And that also is one of my favorite spots. I don't know if you took there's a back channel there formed by sort of the shifting of the mouths, and so you can go back there and there's no traffic. And that's one of the first. Actually, I've almost only ever canoed with John Rusky, but when I've gone out by myself, I did this back channel. And the book throughout, there's kind of I wanted to have a photo in every chapter to like hopefully give readers a flavor that this is not just a history, but like this is a tour of the river, its own place. And the very first photo is one of my favorite ones. It's a friend took it of like me and some other guys kind of swimming in the river at night. And it's on that back channel at the mouth of the Arkansas River. So
awesome, man. Special place.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just love, so another thing that I thought was interesting in talking, obviously you're doing your part here, getting the word out about the Great Mississippi with your book. And I feel like I have some part to do as well, because man, I love that river. And I was talking with Hap Wilson, who's a canoe guide, on an earlier episode of this podcast. And he mentioned that he is a well-known map maker in doing canoe routes in Canada. And he kind of like offhandedly mentioned that like the reason he started doing canoe routes and map making was to draw people to these spots so that they would be protected. And not just like, to be a map maker to make money, or even just like to get people out there. But it was like kind of counterintuitive to me, because in some aspects, when you find something so awesome and beautiful, it's like, you don't really want the whole world to go out there, because you don't want to go out there the next time and, there's a million people at your fishing spot. Now, luckily on the Mississippi, it's plenty big river. There's nothing to worry about.
A lot of space.
But it got me thinking, like, there needs to be more like canoe routes or guidebooks. And then with your, I saw your pitch of the Lower Mississippi National Park. Man, I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the people who own all that bachelor land wouldn't want to give it up. But yeah, that same question of like is something I've reckoned with from the beginning. I remember, again, my first story was a profile of John Ruskey, and that was one of the questions I had for him. It was like, well, part of the appeal of this space was that like we were on this island and no one was going to be there. And do you really want more people here? And like, I think the Lower Mississippi is an interesting thing, because like it's fared pretty well ecologically, all things considered, right? That like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has said all the engineering down there is not a threat to any currently endangered species. So it's not that it's like pristine, but it's like things are surviving. But it's because it's so big, right? Like it's so big that it's got more resilience. But still, there's just so much going on that and so much engineering that I do feel like I would sacrifice a little bit of my isolation on some of those islands if it meant we had more people that had like an intimate relationship and would argue for it. So there's a line in the book at the end of the introduction where I'm like, yeah, like I hope people who read this book are convinced that they should go out and spend some time there, because I think we'll make better decisions if more people are like, oh no, this is a river I care about. Yeah,
100%, man, 100%. And there's a lot to it, and a lot of beautiful parts, that's for sure. So you're doing tours up and down this summer for your book, right?
I am. Yeah. So I am. I mean, it's June now. I'm kind of doing a Mississippi jaunt up a little bit into Memphis next week, and I'm excited to take a little couple days in the canoe with that. Although I think it might be in the middle of a heat wave, so we'll see how it goes. And then I've got some events up in August on the Upper River in La Crosse and Winona and in Minneapolis, and hopefully going to find some more while I'm up there.
That's awesome. And it's cool. It's cool to be popping up and down all the river towns.
Yeah, it's been nice to have an excuse to go back. Like I said, I was just in St. Louis and kind of like flying over and looking down and be like, oh, I've like gotten to know this river so well that I could look out the window and be like, I know exactly where we are right now. So
I was doing the same thing as I was listening to your book. I was flying and just last week, and I was looking over and I was like, the alluvial valley.
Nice.
Yeah, it's cool to be able to see, like you said, from space, man, all the brown and all the water moving, and it's a beast of a river, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that overhead view, sometimes it's dangerous. I think it simplifies things too much, but with a river this big, it's useful to like sometimes be like, okay, like let me really understand what we've got here by seeing it from above.
So anything else that you're looking forward to about this book with it coming out?
No, I'm just like excited to have it out. I'm excited to see where it goes and where it can take me. I have like some dreams. The Mississippi River is interesting, and I've fallen in love with the Upper River, hoping to spend more time up there. But I've sort of, even though I wasn't initially a Southerner, I've lived in the South for 15 years. And I think of this in some ways as a book about nature in the South that extends to other places, and kind of trying to carve a niche out as a writer that covers nature in the South. I've got some big dreams. I'm hoping to do like launch a magazine about that topic, but that's all a lot of work to be done. So,
hey man, well, if it's anything like this book, I think you're well on your way.
Thank you, Will. Appreciate that.
Absolutely. Well, Boyce, I think we'll wind her down here. Is there anything we didn't touch on? Obviously, it's out on audiobook. It's all the major places where you can get this, right?
Yeah, you should be able to track it down at most bookstores. We got audiobook. You can get the Kindle and then the hard copy. So, hope people will be interested in reading it.
All right, great. Any last thoughts or anything we didn't touch on?
I will let people find it in the book. I think we covered what we need to. So, thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, Boyce. Well, appreciate the time. Book's called The Great River, The Making and Unmaking of Mississippi. And there you have it. That is episode 92 of Buffalo Roamer Outdoors with Boyce Upholt. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure you are subscribed. That way you get the latest episodes downloaded automatically. Stay up to date with what's going on. If you enjoyed it, give us a 5-star rating in Apple Podcasts or Spotify and write a review. That really goes a long way. Or even better yet, share the episode or another episode with an adventure buddy, with a friend. Let them know that there's a podcast they might enjoy. Still got some opportunities for you to join me on a canoeing adventure, on a river adventure. Would love to get out on the water with you. I got a few spots open for 2024 October Buffalo Roamer guided canoe trips in Moab, Utah on the mighty Green River. Absolutely spectacular trip. It's 4 nights, 5 days backcountry canoeing. Check out the details at buffaloroamer.com. 2025 dates coming soon. Would love to get out on the water with you, so come check it out. Thank you to SodaPeakOutfitters.com. Experience true Wyoming wilderness with Soda Peak Outfitters. SREgear.com, family-owned and operated outdoor gear shop. And Fischel Paddles, makers of fine, handcrafted wooden canoe paddles. That'll do it. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you go get some fresh air, get some inspiration, get outside, and we'll catch you downriver.